Hi, my name is Benedict. There's a new device I saw just came out. I have spent really only about an hour playing with it. Normally I don't get too much into these sorts of things, but this one's interesting in part because it solves a problem that I'd actually laid out a solution for maybe 10 years ago and offered to several RE developers around the time of Players, whenever they came out, and said, hey, look, this would solve the issue that Reason doesn't have, like a chord track up the top where you can say change everything that's happening below to B cube minus 73 Dorian mode or whatever, because while that can be dumb, it can also be useful. It's a feature that was actually in opcode Vision way back. You could do it. You had to set the channels which were going to be drums so they didn't get changed, but everything else would just change key scale, and it was there. But then these things all disappeared with the cool doors that, anyway, I saw this just appear actually on YouTube, and I thought, well, okay, now this is interesting because it does do a fair amount of what I suggested should be made. It's called Scale SQ, a tone shifter. Now, this is not for creating audio. This is a player, so it just meddles with the MIDI before it gets to your instrument. By tone, it means that if we have something in one key / scale and move it to a different key / scale, the tonal feeling changes. It's not a filter. It's just changing the way the notes relate to each other, therefore we get a slightly different tone. So here's what it does. You've got the ability to bring your note in. Here's one I prepared earlier, and I'm playing a C because we're in C major, the only key that counts, and I've told this is what we're in, so you need to tell the system first because it does some things. And we can then decide whether we want to just pass through whatever notes. Now that sharp there doesn't belong in C major, so we're just passing it through. We can correct it. Playing a black key, not happening. Playing another black key, it's moved to a D. So you can correct, or what I commonly use in the existing things is that I will fix filter. So when I'm playing them black keys, nothing comes out. The white keys do because I've said we're in C major, which is all about them white keys. So you've got a couple of options as to how that goes. I prefer the filter because it makes you work in the key, which we'll talk about a little bit later. Now, its trick is a couple of things at once. What I've always done is taken the note that I'm working in, which is always C major, where I was working in another key, I'd say, well, let's say I wanted to work in D. I would have to use one player to transpose up 2 semitones. Let's put this back into pass through. So root 2 semitones gets me to the D that I want to be on. And then I would use Scales and Chords to now lock that new improved to D major, minor, whatever I wanted. That required 2 things to set up. And if I was going through a whole piece going, oh no, I'm now going to move the whole thing, or I'm going to insist on composing in C, but I want to hear D, then that would require 2 players for every device. Sounds odious, but you get used to it. So what this does is if we are in C as our root, and we want to move to D major, I'm still playing C. But see how my C has now transformed to a D. So what this is doing is going, okay, you need to tell us what you're doing, what you're feeding into this device. It's good that it doesn't try and guess it because it would guess it wrong. You tell it what you're in, and you then tell it where you want it to go. So like Scales and Chords, you say, okay, this is where I want you to go. And it then moves. So D major, E major, oops, Now playing E, F, G. Now it's dropped an octave here, simply because once we start travelling too far away, then we're in the wrong octave. Our tone changes too much. So it's made a wise decision. It gives us the option, though, to say, okay, if we wanted to keep ascending. Now this is where we've done something different. We're going from G, let's put that back to 0. So we're in G minor and move to D minor. To A, to whatever hell that's going to be. That bit alone makes it really interesting. And then far more useful for working on a whole piece is that this can work in 2 modes. There's a receive mode, and it can receive and send on sync. So I've rearranged the way that things are done here, but because of the order that I made things, I then sort of rearranged them, but the cables just go wherever. So this one I've designated to be my master because it's not in receive mode. This one I've designated to be a slave. So I've said, yes, you're in receive mode. I've taken the sync out, so synchronized to the input of here. And then that output's going off to another device. So now that this is in slave mode or receive mode, you see this is in these are all the things that are going to happen. If I take my bass, it should receive all of these things. Now you can see these changes are happening. It's actually really rather cool. So you can have your master, and then you can have all your slaves. So everything else here, with the exception of drums, is set up as a slave. You'll see how I've got 3 lines. I've got pads, so that's just basically my chord track, a bass, and a lead. So it sounds a bit like this. So that's how that's written in C major. Oh, we've now automated, and we're hearing it in D major. And the thing to note here is that as we change these key scales, the other instruments are following because they've been slaved to it. And every time we change, everything changes. Now, in many ways, that's almost a minute and a half you'd rather have back in your life. But what I'm showing here is that you can move key and scale and make everything in your sequence follow. That's interesting, and while technically doable in Reason already, it would require a lot more automation. But we do have a flaw. This is musically coherent. I don't care whether you like it or not, that's irrelevant. It's musically coherent because it was written in C major, and I'm looking at all the notes as I compose and going, okay, yep, that harmony, that's all right. As such, it works. When I start somewhat randomly moving it to other keys and scales, it becomes less coherent. One of the problems, obviously, is that we need to be aware how we're moving from one key to another. As we modulate, as in move from one key scale to another key scale, they need to be reasonably compatible. Now, there are a couple of things that have been factored in here. You see how this has some orange keys lighted? That's telling us that these are not common between these two scales. Obviously, the fewer keys that we have highlighted, the more compatible they are going to be. The more you have, the less compatible they will be. So if we just lock this into the first one, so the sequence of it's not working, and I move to E, it starts to sound a bit, because we've gotten used to C as our key and scale, and suddenly we've turned it into something else. Obviously, I'm just crashing from one to another, that's not jazz, boys and girls. It's just bad. So it is a challenge, but it will be more challenging than if we went from, say, C to F. You see there, we barely notice the change. There is a sense of, oh, we've just done this, but there isn't a, what did you do? You don't know what you're doing anymore kind of a thing. So the way that it works is you can't automate here, you automate from here. Fair enough. You choose, as I said, the route. You then choose where you want to go to. So we've got a couple of ways. We can click here and then choose, okay, I want to go to D and I want to go to D Lydian. Why not? You will find some key scales just drop some notes. Maybe there just aren't enough to know where to go. I don't know. I haven't read anything on this at all. Maybe there is some sort of explanation as to what's happening there and how to fix it. But it is going to lead to one of the concerns that I have about this kind of device in general. So that's one way of creating something. We can also, and it tells us here, I can press Control and Alt on my Windows 11 machine, and this will supposedly limit what it's offering me. Wise or reasonable modulation choices to move from A to B position. So it gives me diatonic moves, parallel moves, chromatic moves, and the circle of filths. And as you may have noticed on the back, there is a circle of filths. What that is, I have never known, and nor do I really care to know, because apart from being a cool name for a modern metal band, the circle of filths sucks. But let's say I choose color shift to E major. Alt lets you copy and paste things. Paste special, I don't know, need to RTFM for that one, but there is the ability to reset. Improvise just seems to randomly choose one of these. Don't know what that's about, so I'm not going to make any real judgment on it. My concerns with this, the issue that we're going to need to think very carefully on, is that these things are presented as a how to write better music without knowing anything about harmony. The reality is, as you noticed when I was playing through this, as we get into more and more random different key scales from where I started, is that the material starts to make less and less sense. Our key in a scale works because there is a logic to it, and you can make up any kind of random thing. I wrote several pieces that just had 3 random notes. I said, okay, I'm going to use a C, a D, and an E, and that's going to be everything that's available for this piece, and they are coherent pieces. Again, doesn't matter whether you think they're cool or not, they are coherent musically. So that's all these things kind of are. Someone said, okay, well, if we do that, then a lot of these things have come through from different cultures or whatever. No argument with them at all. But if you're writing in one key scale, you'll probably find that it's not very coherent when you go to another. And I'm not talking about compatibilities per se. People would go on and rabbit about that. It's simply because just as when we write something in Spanish and literally translate it to English, we often end up with problems. Or problems often we end up with. because literal translation is not the same as actually having somebody who is intelligently bilingual. Somebody who can think and feel in both Spanish and English is going to read the Spanish and go, this is what an English person would write in this situation. So backwards sentences, backwards we do not get. Be very, very careful that when you write and say, now I'm just going to willy-nilly change my piece into Super Locrian, then you'll probably find that your piece just gets gibberishified. It becomes a bit stupid because it hasn't taken into account the thinking, the logic of this key. You're better off saying at the beginning, okay, I'm trying to write this piece and that's not working. Okay, now this is the thing that works. This is what I need. This is the key and scale that I need to make this work. And that often comes by freeforming. So if we go back into chromatic, okay, that's cool. My hook sounds nice there. I now just need to work out what key or scale that's going to work in. So I've got a C, a sharp, an A, and a B. And I've got to find where that's going to belong. What has that shape? And so that just means working my way through keys and scales until I find something that has that, and preferably in a sensible place. So we've got that close move there. So where do you have a close move? Your move when you're in C, let's go back here so you can see it. That's a semitone move. That's a semitone move. So if I'm playing, I need to find something that this is going to be coherent in. I might say maybe D is going to be but then we don't play a C in D at all. So I'd have to know and find my things to find one that does that. And that's where it starts to get somewhat complex. And again, where this has happened, it's well, that's moved it. That's not the piece that I was playing. And it doesn't make it wrong, but is not the same as whatever that is. I've got to find the keys that actually work. So it does require better than randomness to really make these things work intelligently. So what I would do is go, okay, well, if this is what I'm playing, I'm simply going to decide a key or scale that fits, including just inventing it. I don't need to know the formal name that somebody else gave it. I can just say, oh, okay, what's that? I just need something that's going to give me access to keys that way, including just inventing it. What else do I want in the rest of the octave? So we know that didn't work. It was uncomfortable. So now that I've got those two sections, I can put them together and say, okay, which notes do I have? And then decide, okay, what's my scale going to be? It requires some thought, but by putting that thought in, you're either going to, if you know all your keys and scales, which we assume you don't or you wouldn't be using this, you're then going to simply say, okay, that's what I'm deciding my key and scale is. So that's where if we were using... where is it? It's harder to find things in this new system. So if I've got... turn that off. That becomes annoying. So I want to have those two. I'm going to say I don't want that one. I want that one in. I want that one in, but I don't want that one. I want that one in. I know so far that that's what I want. So, hang on, I did need that one in. So you needed those two. So, we know there's something inelegant in the middle here, so... works for me. I can say that's my scale. I can then decide, well, okay, where do I want to route this in? So we might say, I don't know, let's say we want that to be E. People are going to say, you can't do that, and I really couldn't give a flying banana peel, because if I make my piece work that way, that's my piece, that's what's going to give my piece its real colour. It's this thinking and care that means that now when I compose, I'm going to have this as my map to help me. It's like, oh, no, can't press that key, and this is where the filter notes comes really in handy. And then I can lock all of these. Now I can obviously just do a copy and paste. As I said, I used to put and this is something that this device does and is cool in its sense. A note tool will do the job. If we put that before our scales and chords, then we would simply say, okay, if I'm now going to work in E, assuming I was still insisting on writing in C major, which is a problem, I would then simply have to just offset by 4 semitones. So I'm playing C. But then it gets really hard to know what is what. And while saying, oh, well, I'll just use the custom, you're going to miss some keys. Did we miss something? Yeah, we did. We missed something. And that's not intelligent composing, because we're going to have broken our key or scale, in a sense, by simply not using one of the kooky notes we decided to put there for cause and effect. So I don't use this function anymore of adjusting the pitch. I simply say, okay, I'm rooting myself in E. I'm deciding that's where my piece lives, and then I will work this way. I like the Scale SQ tone shifter in that it does solve that problem of moving your key and scale. So you can play everything in C major and or whatever you're playing in and automatically move it to you start having problems and your piece will become broken very, very fast. So please don't think that because this does it, and it does it fairly elegantly in many ways, it doesn't actually give you the intelligence of saying, okay, this is the key and scale I have chosen for whatever reason by whatever process, whether that's choosing one that God made already and gave a pretty name to, which this locks you into. There doesn't seem to be a way to DIY. Or to say, okay, I'm going to DIY, whether this has a name or not, it's the Benedict Special, and that's what I'm using, and I will compose with this, and by filtering the notes out, if I try and play things that aren't there, I'm going to know when it comes back from the sequencer that is like, that's not right. So in this sense, I'm actually training myself to understand this key as I write, and when I write, what I write will be more coherent, because it's going to make sense within the logic that I described here. Again, someone who has been to harmony school and theory school is going to say, you can't do that because of yes, sir. But if your piece works and it sounds cool, then living on the ceiling, no more room down there, who cares? So it's an interesting device. Do I think I'm going to get it? Well, half of me is a little bit like, oh, but it sort of solves a problem. And the other half of me is like, well, it solved a problem that I had before I started actually solving the problem for myself. And the more I solve the problem for myself, the less I need that kind of thing. And again, note that I haven't solved the problem for myself by going off to theory school. I've solved the problem by giving myself a basic understanding of harmony. If you want to understand what I've got, then I made lots of videos about that. There's a whole series on composing, and I work through the basics of how you can work out how to do this. As I just showed here, I made a key scale here that's going to work for whatever piece I write using said abomination. There's nothing wrong with that. That's how it's done. So long as I then carry this to every instrument after and obey the key and scale that I've given, or break it intelligently, like sort of saying, okay, now in this situation that doesn't work, because there are plenty of pieces where, let's say we're working in good old-fashioned C major, but sometimes that's just necessary. Sometimes you're working in a piece and that just becomes necessary at one stage. If it's necessary all the way through the piece, then you've probably just got a shifted F. That's probably what your key and scale is. Or you might even have it as a... If it's consistent, then you make it consistent, or it'll become problematic. But there are times where you're doing... And at a certain point in the piece, you just want to go flat. And that's one of the problems with these sorts of systems, is that it stops you from being able to do that. And if that's the case, you go through, you've done what you've done, and then you're going to have to turn these things off. But the more you do that, the better you get at the real thing, and you'll then actually be genuinely using other keys and scales. This is it's a fudge, and it's a clever fudge because he's put more of the thought into it, and far closer to what I was suggesting all those years ago when I drew up plans for one of these kinds of things, and this is quite similar. It's, you almost kind of wonder if he somehow got his sticky fingers on my plans. But it's a self-evident thing in my mind, so I've got no dramas, whether he did or didn't, because I never wanted a cent out of the thing. I just wanted it made. But now that it's there, I've got to the point where I've trained myself much better by being able to say, okay, I'm not going to do what he's done, which is cool, and it's great that it does automatically move your route, because the problem is that with most of these, if I'm playing, if I say, oh, now I want it to be in a different key, we'll see here, if I say, oh, I'm going to start in C, I'm kind of acting like I'm now in C major, whereas really if it's in E, we should be rooted in E. And the tone shifter has worked that out, which is a big improvement over most of these things that just go, I will randomly just shuffle you to whatever's closest. But again, the problem there is that when you're writing this way, or just randomly transposing, it's not coherent. One of the amazing things with, and he talked about jazz players and what have you, I think someone did, is that where you're using multi-keys and scales and what have you, is that those guys aren't just transposing, they're translating. So like with the writing something in Spanish, literally translating it to English, you end up with gibberish, or gibberish you end up with, because of different structures of languages. Whereas an intelligent player somebody who knows what they're doing. Chick Corea or Peter Frampton or Dave Stewart from the Eurythmics. Any of these people who know what they're doing, they know that what that thing in Spanish is really saying is, and they deliver the same feeling and meaning in English, which is why book translators are not AIs, why they are actually people who are genuinely multilingual. Or if you do read books, and it used to be a big joke back in the 80s and 90s, where synthesizer manuals were written in Japanese, translated poorly sometimes to something like German, and then poorly translated again to English. So you got very poor language. And you see that all the time. Actually, just reading a manual yesterday because we couldn't get, very sadly, my little controller thingy to connect with our computers. So we're reading the manual, which would have been Chinese, probably translated by a Chinese person using Google Translate. And it was like, thankfully this is simple because it's rubbish. And when we're writing music, we shouldn't be writing rubbish. Just because we've got a drum beat doesn't mean that our stuff is actually good. So, interesting device. Some things thought through well. Some things could be just a little easier, like the Alt to allow you to reset a thing. I found that by chance. Oh yes, I should RTFM. I should. But I didn't, because I also believe that modern software should show its major functions pretty easily. And seeing he's marked this one here with the thing to be able to... Okay, obviously for the second one, to give more coherent suggestions, it's been written here, could have written it somewhere else. Just those kinds of things. But ultimately, my concern, like all of these things, once I spend a little bit of time with them, is that they're probably more of a cripple crutch, as in a crutch that teaches you to be lame, rather than simply saying, okay, I'm going to have the courage to work out what my key and scale is, or simply randomly choose one, and then write in that, rather than writing in C major or whatever you always write in, and then pretending that I'm writing in another key or scale, because the choices you make are not the same. Even though you can say, oh, well, this has automatically transposed me up to E, the decisions you make are not going to be quite the same. They're not going to have the same depth of understanding as when you've got the proper key and scale in front of you, and especially if the notes are filtered out, to actually make you say, okay, these are the notes I can use, how can I make them flow together and be coherent? Just going, oh, well, I've got noises, and noise A follows noise B follows noise C, is not coherent. You've made a noise, but you haven't made music. So whether you find this interesting or not, I don't know, to be honest. I don't know whether I find this device interesting. The more time I spend with it, the more I start to think it probably doesn't really serve a purpose for me. For other people, it's going to serve a purpose, but I will question you if you're going, oh, but that's the, that makes me not need to do this, that, and the other. Is sort of go, well, is what you're doing coherent when you're on the other side of it? And if so, are there ways that devices like this could be built better? And while there seem to be flaws in what Reason built with, say, scales and chords, like it used to annoy me, oh, well, you've got to transpose to, play in C and get E major. I now am thinking they were actually a lot smarter than my fear-based narrow-mindedness, in that this ends up being more versatile. If I really need to do it, I can just add another device, and it's not that much of a biggie, really. If you're work averse, like you're averse to putting in your devices, you can always just save off a combinator with Europa and the players that you need to do said task. And if you need to change the instrument, you could just go, okay, and drag another instrument on top of that one. It's not tricky. So I'm neither for nor against, what I am urging great caution in being against is the idea of thinking you're writing in another key than the one that you're actually writing in, because chances are what you deliver will be somewhat incoherent, not really using the power of that key and scale.